May 1941, the German Luftwaffe had mounted a successful airborne invasion of the island of Crete, the first ever. Despite huge losses, elite paratroopers known as the Fallschirmjäger had gained control of the key airport at Maleme. But the 30,000 defending Allied troops hadn't given up. Poorly armed and without air cover, the question was, should they have been there at all?
The British shouldn't have fought the campaign because they didn't have the resources to win. To send young men into an environment where you can't win, they just shouldn't do that sort of thing.
The unfortunate aspect, particularly for the Anzacs, for the Australians and the New Zealanders, was that they were actually the only infantry formations who were not actually engaged in fighting the Germans in North Africa at the moment that Churchill insisted that aid was sent to Greece.
I don't think British High Command had an option. I think they had to defend Crete, but they probably knew that it was doomed from the outset. Fortunately, the men who fought didn't know that they were fighting a doomed campaign, and their courage stands alone.
Despite a looming controversy, Allied troops would mount a series of desperate rearguard actions and sea battles. Their chief aim now was to protect their troops and get them off the island.
This is Dunkirk on a slightly smaller scale.
As the Allied troops fell back from the Maleme airfield, a series of bitter battles occurred, the first of which was in the village of Galatas. Every year, this modest memorial is the site of a commemorative service attended by Cretan and New Zealand dignitaries.
And this was, in the words of Bernard Freyberg, the commander-in-chief of the New Zealand troops, it was the hardest and most savage battle that the New Zealand Division fought in World War II. And this was a man who was also in command in Cassino.
The narrow lanes and streets of Galatas were the site of bitter close-quarters combat. Given its strategic importance atop a small hill between the lost airport at Maleme and the Allied lines between Hanya and Suda Bay to the east, it was the first of several rearguard positions taken by the Allies. Even today, war relics have a useful purpose in the old houses here. The historic city of Hanya, occupied by the Venetians for 450 years, was heavily bombarded. 13 Venetian palaces were destroyed in a brutal bombing campaign. The first of many thousands of POWs were already being rounded up. In addition, there was the gruesome task of burying the dead. There were atrocities on both sides. The Royal Navy's role in the unfolding battle would be crucial. Initially tasked with intercepting German reinforcements arriving by sea, the fleet had needed to sail from Egypt and was repeatedly attacked by dive bombers. For the British, there would be more casualties at sea than on land. Admiral Cunningham, the commander of the Mediterranean Fleet, had nearly 30 ships off Crete on the morning of the invasion. 2 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 17 destroyers. But over the course of the battle, 2/3, 17, would either be sunk, damaged, or lost.
The major port infrastructure, such as it is in Crete, is all to the north of the island, and the British base, which is going to act for resupply, is essentially Alexandria. So you've got a 420-mile supply line, and the last part of that is within range of German air power. They're going to have to travel a significant proportion of this at night to avoid being seen by aircraft or attacked by aircraft. Bringing in of supplies and extra resources from Egypt has to be done by the Royal Navy. Now, if you'd had a good port on the south coast of Crete, that would have been significantly easier. But it isn't, so every supply will have to go either east or west of the island, which makes it a very predictable route for those who want to interdict this. We're trying to make sure you arrive at a particular point at a particular time, so you can do the last leg under cover of darkness. If anything goes wrong and you're visible in German-controlled skies when the sun rises, as sometimes happens, you're in trouble. And this puts a lot of strain on the naval personnel, but they keep going anyway. Once we're in Crete, they also have to try and stop the Germans or the Italians landing by sea on Crete, and that obliges them to run operations to the north of the island under German air attack. And the German air attack is very efficient, and when you're at the end of your 420 miles, route, if you face a German air attack, you could expend 70-80% of your anti-aircraft ammunition fighting it off, and then you're left with a decision: do we go home whilst we can still defend ourselves, or do we keep going with whatever particular task we've got? And the men who are operating the ships are under considerable strain, Stuckeritis, as some of them call it, under continuous air attack from German dive bombers and bombers. They lose a lot of people and a lot of ships.
The two most serious losses, the cruisers Gloucester and Fiji, are sunk when they're sent back to pick up survivors, and they don't have enough anti-aircraft ammunition on board. They're not capable of defending themselves. That sense that you go back for your people is a really important part of building morale, particularly for a navy. So they did that, but they didn't check whether those ships had the firepower to go back and do the job. So that's 20,000 tons of cruisers sunk, essentially because they hadn't checked the ammunition lockers.
One of them, HMS Gloucester, would lose 715 out of a crew of just over 800. Melvin Baker was on the Gloucester when it was sunk.
The inevitable happened. We ran out of anti-aircraft ammunition, and the Luftwaffe has so much force of planes coming at us right, left and centre that eventually we took one too many bombs, and that was the end of the Gloucester. I thought to myself, look, I'm going to survive this. There's no way I'm going to give up, because a lot of people, to me, they were virtually hardly any time in the water. They just gave up. They just floated away. They made no effort to save themselves, and others were clambering over, just about drowned. A few of them just about drowned me, trying to use me to lever themselves out the water and all the rest of it. As the numbers dwindled, then I was able to get onto the raft sometime during the night. Eventually, a German plane flew over, and when I saw this coming towards us, I thought, oh, please, no more machine gunning, because they had machine guns in the water and dropped bombs amongst us when we just shortly after we were sunk. And the crew was absolutely exhausted. That's why I think so many of them that had enough, they just gave up. We were left in the water, and if the Germans had not picked us up the next day, not one of us would be alive. I lost a lot of friends there, because there were only 4 of the South Africans survived. Yeah, there were 32 on board and 4 of them survived.
Its sister ship, HMS Fiji, lost 250 hands when it too was sunk on May 22nd, attempting to help rescue crew from the destroyer HMS Greyhound. Norman Lewis was a bandsman on the Fiji who survived.
She went down about 5 o'clock in the evening, in broad daylight. And unfortunately, those chaps who were in the water were machine gunned by the Germans from their planes. I suppose 600 or 700 of the crew in the water, we didn't see a soul. Strange, isn't it? They all sort of drift away with the tide. And we just sort of floated and moved around in the dark. You get so cold. And you just had to keep singing or talking or doing something to keep you awake. Otherwise, you just go to sleep. And away you'd go. We saw that pinprick of light. Just that tiny, tiny light in the distance. And that sort of lifted our spirits. We made for it as best we could. Of the 15 of the band, there were 7 of us. And we thought, well, the other 8 would be on Kingston. But we wouldn't know until we got back to Alexandra. And when we went ashore and gathered in this huge shed building, there was only one, Albert. The other 6, unfortunately, we lost. Like many, many times, I just asked the question, why? Yeah, why?
The HMS Kelly, a destroyer commanded by a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, a future Sea Lord and Viceroy of India, but then only a Captain Louis Mountbatten, was also among the ships sunk. Mountbatten lost half his crew of 200, the others, including himself, rescued from the sea while still being machine-gunned by some of the 27 Stukas that had attacked.
He's picked up in the water and he's brought back and goes on to greater things, and he's able to tell this story many times thereafter.
Plymouth has a long tradition as a naval city, and remembrance ceremonies here commemorate the losses at sea during the Battle of Crete. Eve Farden lost her 18-year-old brother when the HMS Gloucester was sunk.
My brother lost his life. So that's my brother, Eddie.
He was 18.
He joined the Navy as a boy to see the Royal 16, sailed from Devonport, new ship, never to return.
And your mother received a telegram, didn't she?
Yes, she received a telegram to say that the ship had sunk in Crete and must presume killed. Then they had another telegram to say that he was safe in Alexandria. Then they had another telegram after the war then, because we expected him to come home. And then after the war, he didn't come, and they said, very sorry, that was a mistake. He was never taken off the ship. So that she had a double blow.
Soon, the Royal Navy's role would change, from stopping German reinforcements landing on Crete to a rescue mission, getting Allied soldiers off the island. On May 26th, 6 days after the invasion, the commander on Crete, General Freyberg, let his commanders in the Middle East know the battle was over and the evacuation would begin. The route chosen for more than 15,000 troops was from the battlefields around Hanya up over the central mountain range to the small port of Horosfakion, known as Fakia, where Royal Navy ships would spirit the survivors across the Mediterranean to Alexandria in Egypt. Crucial in delaying advancing German troops now moving east from the Maleme airfield was an action fought here. It is known as 42nd Street. With troops now falling back, the front line now centred on this sunken road that ran southeast from Hanya to Suda Bay, the giant naval port and harbour that had been crucial for incoming supplies delivered by sea. 42nd Street would become the last hurrah for the defenders of Suda Bay, mainly New Zealand and some Australian troops, who would undertake most of the land combat operations on Crete. As the two sides slugged it out, Maori soldiers from New Zealand reverted to traditional methods. Their war cry, known as the haka. More than 80 German troops were killed in the action.
They have a warlike tradition, and they're extremely brave, and there they were, and they killed a lot of Germans. In fact, difficult to stop them and pull them back.
There was a young private here called Hemara Aupori, who, in the face of a savage German advance, was given the order to lead a counterattack. And he got up when given the order to attack and launched into an impromptu haka. It was a kamate, a great haka. That was the spark for an incredibly brave and ultimately successful counterattack that drove back the Germans and ultimately saved thousands of troops who were then able to be evacuated through the channel that he was protecting down to the southern coast.
Today, the 42nd Street ceremony features a reenactment of the haka by Manu Bennett, whose father led a battalion that saw action in Crete and the Middle East.
The haka are words of inspiration. It means the battle is coming, prepare yourself. Grab a firm position on the ground and think this: if I take one step forward, if I take another step forward. If I look to the sun, if I make enough noise so that the sun can hear me, then I will live to see the sun again. It's men, especially in this position here, who are affirming to themselves that they will be warriors in this moment, affirming to themselves that they will live through this ordeal. And they stood here and they did this haka that resounded all through this area. They actually created enough fear from their performance that they overcame even the resolve of the German military in this area. And that's why this battle is remembered, because it was one time where Māori truly behaved like Māori warriors, and with the haka they won a battle.
Further east, the Germans had been met with stubborn resistance trying to take the airfields at Rethmanon and Heraklion. The Rethmanon area had been defended by 2 Australian battalions, commanded by Colonel Ian Campbell, but they were now cut off from their commanders further west.
The Australians stayed perfectly still. There was no sound, no movement during the day. All movement prior to the arrival of the Germans was done at night. The Germans were quite surprised, indeed shocked, by the level of resistance they met on the 20th of May when they actually started to land.
The Germans were unable to take both the town of Rethmanon and its airport. Overlooking the airport on what was known as Hill A, the Australians were able to keep the Germans at bay. The grandparents of Dimitris Skatsalakis witnessed the battle, and he's researched the battlefield in forensic detail.
Campbell captured Hill A. Hill A was the most vital hill for Rethmanon, of course, because it overlooked Rethmanon airfield.
They inflicted massive casualties. Within the first few days, the Australians had essentially won at Rethmanon. They had secured the airfield. That was their task, and they had done that.
They did such a good job there that student wrote off the attack altogether.
We could say that Hill A was the bloody hill for the Germans.
The Germans retreated to the high ground offered by the Church of St. George. You can still see the bullet holes in the church facade and the damage to the cemetery caused by the fierce exchanges.
So these are small teams of people hunting each other in the olive groves and amongst the grapevines, killing each other at very close range. These are groups of maybe a dozen soldiers. And so it's lethal. It's a deadly, deadly battle. of hide and seek, if you like, in that environment. Hundreds of Germans were killed. Hundreds more were captured. And again, in an under-resourced garrison, there's no facility for taking prisoners, and so a temporary prison cage was created. Both Australian battalions had around about 600 soldiers at the start of the campaign, 620 to 650 men. By the end of the campaign, they'd lost at least 2/3 of the strength of both of those battalions. But the Germans had suffered enormous casualties. Well over 50% of both German battalions were killed or captured within the opening days of the fighting.
During the fighting, local villagers who lived near the coast, located west of the airport, were herded onto the beach here. Suspected of collaborating with the Allied soldiers, they were executed. Vasilis's mother was among them. He never saw her again.
Η δεύτερη εκτέλεση έγινε πάλι από τους άντρες από το άλλο καφενείο. Τους έφεραν εδώ ακριβώς, εδώ που είναι το κενοτάφιο. Τους γκάζωσαν και μετά τους έριξαν βενζίνα και αυτά και τους έκαψαν με το αυτό για να μην φαίνεται τα... Φτάσαμε εδώ πέρα, αυτό είπα και προλίγου. Αφού λοιπόν έδωσε το σημείωμα, αρχίσαν να μας κλωτσούν και να μας πηγαίνουν από εδώ. Αυτό το κομματάκι από εδώ πήγαμε μέχρι τη θάλασσα, μέχρι εκεί. Εγώ με τη μαμά μου, τον πατέρα μου, τη γιαγιά μου, τη θεία μου, όλα μαζί. Αγκαλιές, φιλιά, κλάματα. Και σας είπα και προλίγο ότι θυμάμαι τη μάνα μου που έλεγε ότι αν σωθεί κανείς, με τα κλάματα να κοιτάξει τα παιδιά, είπε στους άλλους που είμαστε μαζί.
Vasilis says he was saved by Australian soldiers raining fire down on the beach, disrupting the massacre.
Δηλαδή, αυτό που σωθήκαμε ήταν ότι οι Αυστραλοί και οι Αγγλέζοι βάναν από το... πέρα από τα υψώματα που λέω το αυτό και πέφτανε εδώ κάπου οι οβίδες και φοβηθήκαν οι Γερμανοί το βράδυ, οι εκτελεστές, και φύγανε. Και έτσι μείναμε ζωντανοί όλη νύχτα περιμένοντας το εκτελεστικό απόσπασμα. Δεν ξέραμε που πήγανε. Όσο μπορώ σου βοηθάω, πατέρα.
Meanwhile, Freiburg's evacuation order hadn't been picked up by Colonel Campbell's Australians. The Australian battalions were effectively abandoned, but carried on defending the airport. They would eventually surrender. Campbell and his surviving troops spoke about it in 1991.
I went down the little path onto and across the airstrip and surrendered my force at Retimo.
We all went down onto the airstrip. The Messerschmitts came in and did their ruddy victory rail over us, and we just sat on the airstrip, and they said, just shut your tin hats in a heap, and that was it.
By far the biggest proportion of Australian troops who ended up as POWs were taken in Greece and Crete.
Today, commemoration ceremonies in Rathmanon honour the battle here, which involved both Australian and Greek troops. Here, Greek and Australian dignitaries attend, reflecting the special bond that formed between the two. Michael Lawrence's father was one of those in Colonel Campbell's battalion who surrendered and spent the next 4 years in a prisoner of war camp.
My belief is that it was particularly hard for them during those years that were crucial, in 41, 42, 43, to be sitting in a prison camp and unable to do anything. He was haunted by a couple of things all through his life, including as a junior officer, and they were at the front line when the first half of Hill A was gone on the first night, and here they are with guns, with no small arms. And one of the elite, one of the paratroopers, I don't know how to pronounce the false conjuga properly, was crying for his mother all night. And my father was a gentleman, but he wouldn't let his troops go and rescue him because At that point in history, the German army was regarded as almost invincible, almost superhuman, the paratroops being the best of the best, and his view was that in that first crucial night, anything that made them seem less superhuman was good. Come here with my 3 adult children. I guess I wanted them to learn something of the story for themselves, and beyond my dreams, that has happened in the last 36 hours. It's a connection to their grandfather and to their story, which is, I think, is important to them.
In Rethymnon today, Dimitris Skatsalakis runs the bakery his grandparents, who witnessed the war, founded, producing all manner of cakes and sweets. But at home, he's massed a collection of war paraphernalia, collected from the Rethymnon battlefield, and more than 8,000 photographs. Many obtained from Germany, even the personal albums of German soldiers.
It contains many pictures from the time of, from the early stages of the war, we can say. Then it goes to the Battle of Crete. This particular album has about 100 pictures from the Battle of Crete. Well, we could say that these are the true photos, not propaganda photos, everyday life, killed soldiers, graves, prisoners of war, their comrades in the plane, bombings, everything. We can find a lot of information in these albums.
Further east, in Heraklion, the German paratroopers had been dropped on and around the city. Heraklion today still has a busy sea and airport. But by the 28th of May 1941, it was decided to evacuate sorely pressed troops from Heraklion. A force of 9 Royal Navy ships, including 6 destroyers, had been sent from Alexandria.
4 destroyers arrived, took off the entire force. Dive bombers followed, did horrible damage at sea.
Alf Carpenter was evacuated on the HMS Imperial and survived.
As soon as daylight came, the dive bombers started coming on us, and the skipper of the ship was on his back up in the wheelhouse with his binoculars, and every time one of the dive bombers, they started to let go a bomb, he'd sing out harder port, harder starboard, so he was zigzagging his way out of the things that were coming down.
2 ships out of the 9-ship convoy had been sunk, and 3 more badly damaged, including the flagship Orion. More than 600 lives were lost.
After that, when the dive bombers come in, we had enough lead going in the air to keep them out of the way. We brought one plane down, and that's how we got back to Alexandria.
Englische Arroganz. Jetzt noch frech werden, Tommy.
While many Allied soldiers on the north coast were surrendering or being evacuated, thousands were heading for the south coast in hope of an evacuation by the Royal Navy at Sfakia. On this forced march across the island, weary soldiers were constantly exposed to overhead attack by German fighters, abandoning their equipment along the way. Already exhausted troops would rest here at Vrissis, by the stream, before beginning an ascent on the one road up into the mountains. Nowadays in spring, brilliant red poppies line the road to Sfakia. In 1941, it was little more than a dirt donkey track. Now paved and widened, it's lonely still for most of the day, with only the occasional passing car and sounds of goats in the field disturbing the silence. Traditions remain on Crete. Today, shepherds and their sheep take priority on these narrow mountain roads. As it winds up, the landscape becomes rocky and barren. All along the road to Sfakia, rearguard troops were installed at strategic points to slow down the German pursuit. As almost 20,000 fleeing troops tried to get off the island. The evacuation route has been mapped by writer and historian Michael Sweet.
On the morning of the 29th of May, this was the first blocking point on the mountain. Here, New Zealand troops were on the high ground, Australian troops with them, all the way over to the peak over there. And what they saw early on the morning of the 29th of May was German troops coming through the pass down there. What they did with the rearguard was they would set up a blocking point for a few hours, lay down fire on the advancing Germans, slowing them down, slowing the German advance down, buying time for the troops to get off at the evacuation beach, and then they would leapfrog back, covering each other.
In 1941, as now, the departing troops then reached the Askifu Plateau, a fertile valley overlooked by an old Turkish fortress. The Turks, like all other invaders, never really controlled this part of the island. The fort only remained here for 10 years of their 300-year occupation.
The next blocking point was over there, the entrance to the Askifu Plain. It was known as the saucer to the troops in those days. And what happened there was a group of 50 men armed with machine guns, rifles, a mortar, and actually a tank managed to hold back the Germans for about 3 hours. What the sum total of that meant for the rearguard for that night's evacuation is that 6,000 troops got away.
The valley is tranquil today, but 80 years ago the skies buzzed with German aircraft, exercising their supreme military power. The evacuating troops were vulnerable here, and more equipment was jettisoned. It's found a home in a private museum run by Andras, whose father started it just after the war. He also collected German equipment later found abandoned. It gives an idea of how well equipped the Germans were. These backpacks were fur-lined, so as to be used as pillows too. Continuing on, the road to Sfakia then descends down precipitous gorges and mountainsides. The hairpin bends today give an indication of the journey thousands of soldiers had to make by foot. The road stops 3 kilometres, 500 feet above the village of Sfakia and the coast.
We're at a position where the old road finished, and the aim was to get to Sfakia, which is over there. There was no modern road in those days. There was a goat track, basically, from where the old road finished through to Sfakia. Thousands of them came down. It's hard to imagine the scale of what we're talking about here. Thousands of them had crossed the White Mountains, were coming down the gorges, were going towards Sfakia or towards Komitadis. You have to imagine that this plain was full of thousands of soldiers, and they all wanted to get on the boats. They were exhausted. They had fought for 7, 8 days. They had had hardly any food. They had been harassed in the daytime by German fighters for nearly 2 weeks. They were at the end of their tether. They were in a dreadful state. They were so hungry and thirsty then that some of them resorted to chasing wild chickens, killing them and eating them raw. That's how bad it was. The Germans had split up. They had come forward from Askifu. They had gone down the ravines on the right-hand and the left-hand side. And on the night of the 31st, the last unit that was on this mountain, protecting the troops going to the beaches, was the 2nd 7th Battalion, the Australian battalion.
A lot of those blokes were carrying ammunition in their pockets. Some of them were barefoot. They were carrying any rifles they could pick up. They'd fought a great rearguard action, fighting the Germans every step of the way. You know, very, very gallant retreat. The Germans knew if they pushed them too hard, they were going to butt up against some very, very fine soldiers, some well-disciplined soldiers.
Today, the only boats leaving the small port here are tourist ferries going back and forward along the coast. Tourists queue in orderly fashion for tickets. It was vastly different in the last days of May 1941. a memorial dockside commemorates what happened.
This is the beach at Crete ep2 the end of the road for the Allies in May 1941. It was here on May the 31st that the last evacuation took place. This place was crowded. There were thousands of men hanging around, desperate to get onto the evacuation boats. There was a cordon of armed pickets around the men so that they wouldn't rush the boats, the last boats. People were desperate. There were people trying to cheat the lines. There were queues all the way back up the hillside. There was a pecking order. Officers first. There was a pecking order politically. A certain number of Australians, a certain number of New Zealanders, a certain number of Brits. But people were trying to get past the ordering system, so that people would try and cheat their way through the lines, push their way through. This is all happening in the dead of night, yeah, with these throngs of soldiers hanging around, hungry, thirsty, desperate to get off this island. The 2nd 7th Australian Battalion was coming down from the hill that night. They were the last ones of the rear guard, that last unit in the rear guard to keep the Germans at bay. The Germans were advancing from the east, from the west, and from the gorge from Ascifu Plain. The 2nd 7th came down that night. They left their positions at about 10 o'clock. They had a really difficult climb down the mountain. Then they got to the thousands waiting, who resented them going through the ranks, going through the lines. They finally got here to the harbour's edge, and they found that the last barge had gone. And what they could hear in the distance a little while later was the hawser, the anchor, being taken up on the destroyer. And they, along with 5,000 other troops, would stay here, abandoned, and become, almost all of them, prisoners of war.
The Navy did everything they could, but there was only so much space. They got destroyers and cruisers. You know, they couldn't send a troop ship in. So the numbers that could get off were very limited.
This is Dunkirk on a slightly smaller scale. There's an army there to be relieved. The Germans have complete command of the sky, and the Navy goes in and rescues them. In this case, not just with small ships, but with big ones as well. And yeah, it takes a hell of a beating doing that.
They know that if you operate in coastal waters where the enemy dominates the skies, you're in trouble. It's not a surprise for them, but they do it anyway, and they pull people off successfully, and the losses are, in the end, sustainable.
Of the thousands who made it to Egypt, there was one Australian officer offered a place on the boats who was not among them, opting to stay instead with his men. Colonel Theo Walker then walked several kilometres along the coast from Sfakia to the small village of Komitates. It looks much the same today as it did then. It was here that Walker, the most senior officer left on the island, would officially deliver the Allied surrender.
Komitates is, in a way, the end of the story of the Battle of Crete, the battle itself. Of course, the Battle of Crete didn't end on June the 1st. The Allies surrendered. 5,000 Allied soldiers became prisoners of war. Others took to the hills to fight, to try and escape. The Germans began 4 long years of occupation. And in villages like this, the resistance started against the German occupation. So one battle was over, but another had begun.
For the Anzac forces, the Battle of Crete represented a reminder of their famous defeat at Gallipoli a quarter of a century earlier. A campaign that, ironically, had made heroes of the battle commanders on Crete. For New Zealand Commander General Freyberg, another Gallipoli hero, who in the end had spent 10 years of his life fighting the Germans. He would spend the rest of his life defending his decisions and tactics, which his critics maintained lost the island. For the man that commanded Australia's ragtag Cretan forces, Australia's most decorated soldier, General Blamey, also a Gallipoli hero, it was a blemish on a glittering career that had spanned 2 world wars. He was accused of evacuating himself off the island before his troops, and he and other World War I veterans could not escape the criticism that they were old and out of step with modern-day warfare.
One of the problems that the army on Crete faces is that they're led by people who've done this all before on the other way. You know, the Allies, British Dominion troops tried to get into the Gallipoli beachheads. Blamey and Freiburg are both there. It doesn't work. So invading across the sea, probably not going to work. Probably made them feel quite confident. They're sitting there with quite a lot of troops. They've got the Royal Navy behind them. What can go wrong? And also, being a brave and effective junior leader in the First World War doesn't mean you're going to cut the mustard as a senior leader in the Second World War. And quite a lot of soldiers fail to make that transition from commanding men under fire to actually conducting war. So the great generals of the Second World War are few in number, and none of them are on Crete.
In military terms, it's a young men's game, and they were older than Napoleon was at Waterloo. And we see the same thing with Napoleon, where he knows what he wants to do. His strategy in getting to Waterloo is superb, but his timing is off in the battle itself.
Despite the huge losses, these were papered over and the battle was marked with victory parades back in Germany.
The invasion of Crete was celebrated by German propaganda at extraordinary length.
Dem deutschen Soldaten ist nichts unmöglich.
The propaganda would ultimately prove empty. The German boxing champion Max Schmeling, who beat Joe Louis in 1936 to become world champion, became a Nazi pin-up. He jumped with the paratroopers, but hurt himself landing, although the Cretans say he was wounded.
It's a great PR coup. Nazi Germany's super athlete lands as a warrior on this hostile island. It's perfect. You can just imagine how Joseph Goebbels is going to work this into his next publicity broadcast. So modernity is a key element of fascism, and the parachute invasion is a very modern response.
Nazi propaganda pronounced a triumph as awards for the paratroopers were dished out by their commander-in-chief Hermann Göring. Losses were extremely high, however. German commander General Kurt Student would dub Crete the graveyard of the German paratroopers and a disastrous victory. Almost 2,000 German troops were killed on the first day of the invasion alone, out of 4,400 dead. Another 2,600 were wounded in less than 12 days of fighting. Dead and wounded meant half the paratroopers' fighting force became casualties.
Normally, you would expect 3 times as many wounded as killed in a conventional battle. Here we found that there was far more were killed than wounded, which gives you an idea, actually, of quite how lethal the fighting was.
The number of casualties meant that Hitler would never again approve the use of paratroopers in such large-scale operations. More than 250 aircraft, including 150 of the Ju-52 transports, were lost.
And they don't have 250 aircraft to throw away. They're about to launch the biggest operation of their Second World War, Barbarossa, and this Air Force is going to move out of Greece up onto the Russian front. They lose a significant number of pilots, and all the way through the war, quality personnel are going to be critical. By the end of the war, the Germans have plenty of planes, but they've run out of pilots. And they end up with a very large commitment to garrisoning Crete, which ties down a lot of troops for the rest of the war. Because the one thing that the Cretans demonstrate is they really, really, really do not like the Germans, and they still don't.
On the Allied side, 3,000 were dead and a dozen warships lost. More than 12,000 Allied soldiers would be taken prisoner of war, 1/3 of the defending force.
Crete is a position that should have been held, but there's a complete failure of joined-up thinking. If the Royal Air Force had had single-seat fighters operating off Crete, there would have been no Stuka attacks on the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy would have operated much more effectively because it would not have been under constant air attack. The Air Force had to support the Army and the Navy over Crete, and they didn't.
The loss didn't go down well in some parts of the British Empire. Australian Prime Minister Menzies lost power in August 1941, in part due to his conduct of the war in Europe, and in particular in Greece and Crete.
Menzies doesn't come out of this very well because he had agreed to go to London for a 3-4 month period to sit in with the British War Cabinet to concert Australian plans in the overall strategy.
New Zealand Prime Minister Peter Fraser was in Alexandria, welcoming his evacuated and exhausted troops and urging the British to go back to Crete to get more. Menzies was nowhere to be seen.
His reputation was really very damaged by the events in Crete, and his leadership never survived in the Second World War. He was replaced within weeks of returning to Australia.
Australian historians blame Churchill for deceiving the Anzac forces.
He committed the Australians and New Zealanders and the rest of the expeditionary force to Crete to a hopeless cause, really. The Australians were used, really, as part of this overall political purpose of Churchill's, which didn't really square with Australian national interest.
Churchill committed Commonwealth and British troops to Greece to impress American public opinion. But that obviously was not something that you could sell to governments in Canberra and Wellington, and so the British crafted a narrative to tell the Australians and New Zealanders that there would be tanks going to Greece, there would be air cover, and that there was a reasonable prospect of success, when really there was none.
What were their choices? Do you surrender mainland Europe without a fight? Do you surrender the sea lanes, the approaches to the Suez Canal and to British possessions in Egypt without a fight? I don't think British High Command had an option.
There were wider consequences. The devastated British Mediterranean fleet had been expected to head east into the Pacific.
It cost ships, and this was at a time when the threat was growing in the Far East, and there was always the belief, and this was again a false bit of British planning, the British would have enough time to get the bulk of their fleet out to the Far East by the time the Japanese attacked. And that wasn't true, and above all, they didn't have the aircraft to be able to defend their ships because they had underestimated the way that the balance of power in air war and sea war had changed completely.
In 1914, the British went to war with 65 battleships. In 1939, they had 15. They just don't have the numbers to do the job. By the end of this campaign, the Mediterranean fleet really doesn't have much more than a couple of cruisers and a few destroyers. It's basically burned itself up dealing with this campaign, both first securing the island and then getting the troops off. And you start to see that the Royal Navy is running out of assets to fire brigade the next crisis. So when Japan strikes in December 1941, they're lucky to get 2 capital ships to send out to the Far East. They don't have anything else. There's just nothing left in the locker.
So what the British did to honour 20 years of promises that a fleet would go to Singapore to defend Australia was to send an old battle cruiser, the Repulse, and 1 modern battleship, the Prince of Wales, without an aircraft carrier, without any submarines, with too few destroyers, no motor torpedo boats, and the whole thing was a gesture.
But the cost of the battle to the Germans had high strategic value for the Allies. It was credited with delaying the ultimately ill-fated Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia later that year. And German aggression in North Africa and the Mediterranean stalled as a battered Royal Navy interrupted supply routes. General Kurt Student, the World War I fighter ace who'd built the German paratroopers into such an innovative, feared and daring airborne fighting force, went on to salvage his reputation to some extent with a daring and successful raid, also using gliders, that rescued Mussolini from a remote mountaintop in northern Italy after he'd been deposed and captured by Italian royalists. But Student never recovered from the huge losses in the Battle of Crete, and after the war served a prison sentence for war crimes on the island. Overlooking Maleme Airport today are the graves of the feared Fallschirmjäger, or sky hunters, more than 3,000 killed in the Battle of Crete alone. At the commemoration ceremony, veterans from past and present paratrooper divisions are in attendance.
This being together, the staying for each other, living together, fighting together. This is a specific, very specific ethos. It is what we call in German Kameradschaft.
The feared face of Nazi aggression took on a more benign face after the end of the war. But at the end of the ceremony, and in a far corner of the cemetery, some paratroopers still sing the anthem, which the Fallschirmjäger sang before and during World War II. It's a tradition these men still wear with pride. Today, German dignitaries attend the main Allied memorial services too. But even 80 years later, Germans find themselves in an uncomfortable situation. As the aggressors, their shocking losses and counterclaims of atrocities still receive scant attention.
Some officers still tried to bring up the memory of the Battle of Crete, but these activities were not liked, they were not accepted, and in the end, I think they just faded out. So we had no active remembrance and recollection of the Battle of Crete.
Germans today are peaceful. They're no longer interested in the glory of the past. Why should we think of a war? This is gone. We are Europeans united.
Wir bringen dir allen das Leid. Wir bringen dir aber auch die Schuld, die damals Deutsche auf sich geladen haben. Herr, erbarme dich.
Majority of Germans don't like to be told about what their forefathers did during the war, be it brave military action, as some veterans would call it, or the atrocities being committed by certain people. They just don't like to be reminded of this part of their past.
We became one of the most peaceful nations on the globe because we experienced too much. Huh?
After just 10 days of the Battle of Crete, the Germans had taken total control of the island. Next, we look at the brutal and bloody 4-year occupation that would follow.